of a set of 3 webinars that we are going to present in the next couple of months for local governments and communities. And this first one is on the state of the practice in electric vehicle charging infrastructure, public-private partnerships. My name is Patrick DeCorla Souza, and I'm the P3 Program Manager in FHWA's Office of Performance and Innovative Finance. And we're pleased to bring you this webinar. Next slide. A couple of cautions. First, we are recording this webinar so that folks who couldn't make it today can listen to it later on. And second, this is being presented by contractors to FHWA. So any views expressed by these contractors are not necessarily the views of the US DOT or FHWA. Next. A few housekeeping items. If you have a Q&A box in your Teams application, you can put questions in there. Otherwise, put it in the chat and identify which speaker the question is for. We are focusing on public-private partnerships today, so questions should be focused on the P3 issues rather than general technical issues, for which you can always contact the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation, and they are at driveelectric.gov/technical assistance. We will answer your questions as time permits, and those that we cannot answer today will be answered by email. The webinar that you are going to participate in today is based on 2 draft reports that FHWA has produced over the past few months, and they will be available to you to download from the chat. We will also send you an email later so you have links to the reports. Finally, the slides will also be available to download at the end of the presentation, and we will also email you a link later on. Next slide. As I mentioned, this webinar is the first of a set of 3, and we also have a second set of 3 webinars which are focused on issues that states are grappling with. They're similar to what we are presenting today and over the next couple of months for local governments. So today we are presenting the state of the practice. In February, we'll present the procurement process using P3s. And in March, we will present tools and guides to do P3 feasibility and financial structuring. We will also have a couple of training courses, one for states and the other for local governments, and those will be held in April. That will be in-person training, and we will get you information as we approach those dates. Next slide. There's my information, and the rest of the folks here are contractors. Mike Lawrence will moderate this workshop, this webinar. Seth Kirschenberg will talk about the contracting legal issues. The financing issues will be presented by by Christy David and Zach Carson from Rebel. And finally, we will have Robert McCracken from the city of Cincinnati talking about an actual experience that they had in Cincinnati in getting a P3 contract for electric vehicle charging infrastructure. So with that, I will turn it over to Mike Lawrence to moderate the webinar. Mike?
Thank you, Patrick. Next slide, Ethan. So this is our webinar agenda for today. We're going to start off with legal and contracting. We're going to have a Q&A session after that initial presentation. Then we're going to cover funding and financing, another Q&A session. We're going to talk about the Cincinnati experience. I don't think they have a P3 yet, Patrick, but they're working on it. So that will be a third Q&A. And then we have an appendix of some case studies that what some states have already done in putting their P3 packages together. Next slide, please. This is me. I'm Mike Lawrence. I'm an economist, and I advise federal and state agencies on energy and transportation project evaluation, including financial and economic analysis. I've had an opportunity to work for the Federal Highway Administration reviewing traffic and revenue forecasts for about a dozen TIFIA P3 loan applications. I'm currently the co-chair of the Transportation Research Board, Economic Development, and Land Use Committee. Next slide, please. And I'm going to pass it off to Seth, who's going to talk to us about the legal issues.
Great. Hello, everybody. Thank you for introducing me, Mike. If you can go to the next slide. My name is Seth Kirschenberg. I'm a partner with Kutak Rock, and I work on public-private partnerships throughout the country at various levels. I've worked for governments and universities primarily, but I also work with lenders and developers. If we can go to the next slide, please. Great. If we can go to the next slide. So when we're talking about public-private partnerships and the EVCI program, and we developed this particular report to provide you with an overview, to present findings on if you're looking at a public-private partnership, providing some background information on what P3s are, identifying potential legal issues for you to look at, and best practices as we went forward. We also identify a lot of the financing issues that you'll be looking at when you're looking at a public-private partnership and some of the best practices from different cities and states. If we go to the next slide. So really, what is one of these EVCI public-private partnerships? You know, we're really looking at a project that can be utilized along transportation corridors. It could be used for fleet. It could be used for public and retail. It can be used in workplace. And we also think about home use. When we get into the law itself and the program itself, you'll see that these all have to be publicly available to utilize these funds. But that's where the locations of EVCIs can be located. We go to the next slide. So why a public-private partnership, and what is a public-private partnership? Really, a public-private partnership is something where there's a risk for the private sector party who's partnering with government or university or other owner who's looking at this public-private partnership. Many times, the traditional public-private partnership is one that we think of with a design, build, finance, operate, and maintain. And I'll get into that in a little bit. But here, we're really looking at different options of public-private partnerships where you have a private party who's taking some of the risk of the particular project. We go to the next slide. So I'm going to cover some of the EVCI authority, P3 legislation in states, some of the risk, and some of the contract issues. If we can go to the next slide. So really, when we're looking at a public-private partnership, as I said, we're talking about transferring some of the risk to the private sector. That could be the construction risk many times, and most of the time what we see in a public-private partnership is that the contractor is not paid for the work until the work is actually completed and delivered and is operating. So to make sure that the project is operating, so the risk many times of design and construction are put on, or installation in this case, are put on the private sector. Many times the financing is also, and some of the other issues, the management and maintenance, et cetera. So we're pushing risk to the private sector. We're also looking at many of these projects accessing the capital markets, which means there's private financing for these projects versus the financing all coming from the municipal or state government. We're also trying to, this helps reduce the debt burden by transferring some of those debt obligations and risks to the private sector, because they are the party that's responsible for paying back the financing on these particular projects, not the municipality or the state. You're also looking to unlock equity, whether it's financing from the private party directly, or it's their professional skills, And then you're also looking at leveraging private sector expertise and innovation. This will become more clear as we go through. If we go to the next slide. So really, when we're talking about the EVCI program, we're also really looking at the law itself for this program. Let's remember, for these projects, they have to be available to the public. The party who's working on these projects, there can be revenue generation, and that revenue can be used to put back into the project, can be used to support the financing of the project, can be used even for the private sector to make a reasonable profit. The project from operation, so the construction or installation is complete, operation forward has to be for 5 years at least. We can go to the next slide. The 5 years becomes important because we're really looking at these projects. When we talked to a lot of states, they said a lot of these projects they were looking at only for the 5 years of the financing. We want you to really think beyond that when you're looking at a public-private partnership, because it is an endeavor that takes some time to put into through the RFQ and RFP process to look at beyond just those 5 years. Typically in a public-private partnership, we see terms 20, 30, 40, 50 years even for those particular projects. And then the report looks at the various business models that are utilized to date for EVCI and looking at P3 and how that all works together. We go to the next slide. So when we're really looking at a P3, we're really talking about different models. When I look at the EVCI program, you drop down to the bottom, I look at a hybrid. So by that, I mean, there's an availability payment. We've got the funds for the EVCI program for the 5 years that support the project. That will definitely support, or usually support, the construction and installation of the equipment. But that availability-based payment means that there's a government payment coming in. There's also a possibility on these projects. Typically, we see some sort of revenue generation from the users. And so will there be revenue or concession model for this particular project? That's something important to think about. Some of your some communities and some local and state governments want some of these projects to be at no cost. Some of them are going to be supporting governmental entities, and others they want them to be revenue based 100%. So on a P3 project, some are 100% revenue based, and some are based on the availability structure. And then finally, there could be some valuable land here when you're looking at these particular projects. Sometimes you're looking at a lease project, and so in public-private partnership, sometimes the value of that lease can be brought into the project, and that also provides a certain value to the particular developer. But once again, many of these projects are going to be hybrid and integrate all of these. You can go to the next slide. So when we talked about public-private partnership, traditional, I told you before, design, build, finance, operate, and maintain. But a lot of these projects may be design, build, finance, or design, build, finance, or design, build, operate, and maintain, where the financing can even come from the local government. Look at your issues. I'm going to get into questions that you need to ask yourself, but look at what works best for your community, your state, and make sure this contract type fits with your needs. If we go to the next slide. So the other thing is, when we talked about these projects, we already talked about contract duration. Uncertain revenue generation is really a key issue in a lot of these. A lot of times there'll be the first of a kind equipment being installed in a particular area, or there's going to be a lot more electric charging stations and EVCI infrastructure in these particular areas. And so the revenue generation is uncertain. You can structure these deals to look at where the availability payment pays a certain amount, and if revenue starts to generate at a certain level, in that case, you can potentially lower the availability payment or change the structure, or have the additional revenues be reinvested back into the project. So you need to think about those things as you're putting together a public-private partnership. In a typical P3, we're looking at very large projects, $100 million, 20, 50, 100, couple $100 million, even over $1 billion. Here, we're looking more likely at smaller projects, basically because of the cost of the infrastructure installation. So you need to look at that, lower capital costs, make this sometimes a simpler project. Management and allocation of technology risk. We know the technology is going to be changing over time, so it's critical that your projects also integrate those particular issues. And a change in technology, think about reinvestment, especially during that initial 5-year term, whether at the end of those 5 years, whether there's a reinvestment in whatever the new technology is. and whether your availability payments support that particular project. You're always trying to make sure that you have the demand for these particular projects. And then lastly, the public sector reliance for long-term asset ownership. In this case, we're looking at a technology. So in a typical P3, the turnover process happens much later. If it's only a 5-year term, 10-year term, you need to really look at what's going to happen at the end of that term and who's going to own the equipment at the end of that term. If we can go to the next slide. Then also what it's going to look like at the end of that term. So really, when you're creating the public-private partnership contract, you have to really think for yourself, one, is this public-private partnership really right for me and what we're trying to focus on? If so, what kind of public-private partnership? We talked about the various types. Do you know the demand? If you don't know demand, once again, how do you mitigate that particular risk? Who is that risk on? Does the availability payment cover that particular issue? Is there going to be revenue sharing if you have the authority to do revenue sharing? Are those revenues going to be put back into the particular projects? Is it going to build out new infrastructure in the future? Think about all those different types of things. Do you want the users to pay? Do you want to put parameters on those particular costs? We've all learned a lot over time about what the public thinks if they're charged a lot for these for this type of infrastructure. But do you want to cover all of the costs? What's the reasonable return for the private sector? If you're doing this, all plays into that particular issue. Can I combine low and high demand project areas? For example, sometimes when you know demand and you've got a high demand area, that may be revenue generation, revenue producing, where you may be able to help support and offset that, which we do in a lot of public-private partnerships, with an area where there's going to be low revenue or concessions on that particular project. So always think about linking various projects, especially throughout a full community or throughout a state as you're looking at these projects. And then make sure you have and you meet those minimum federal funding requirements at least 5 years, but look for a longer term project as you're looking at it. But once again, it has to fit for you. Go to the next slide, please. So when we're really looking at this, there's a public and private interest. And so in the report, we cover what those things are. The things I want to focus on really here, in the public interest, we want to make sure that the services are available. We want to make sure it's available at a reasonable price. We want to make sure that it's performing properly, those types of things. On the private side, they want to make sure that they're getting a return. They're sometimes, many times, looking at a program and a longer term program for these particular projects. They're trying to build capacity and those types of things. So look at those particular risks, and then also recognize if they're going to finance the project, that the lender is also going to have a profile, and it's going to want to make sure it gets its return and where it is in the priority of the payments versus the concession and the revenues and the reinvestment and those other types of things. If we go to the next slide. So when we look at this, I always tell people, if you look at a public-private partnership, look at your direct contracting method, look at the risk and where it's going to go. And so this particular slide, which is in the report, tries to identify what's the risk for the public and private sector. So typically when you hire a contractor to construct the project, most of the risk is on the public sector side. And then this kind of breaks it off and identifies how the allocation of risk can go across. This is helpful also for decision makers. A lot of times we use this for city councils or states, government agencies for making decisions. If we can go to the next slide. So we also looked at the state laws. This is where we're trying to identify what states have specific P3 authorities, which do not, which have different levels. And even the ones that aren't listed, don't forget they're still leasing authorities, and there may be ways of still doing a public-private partnership as we're going forward. We go through that in the report in depth. If we go to the next slide. So when I look at contracting, I try and break down the contract into different components, and I list out a lot here. And this is not supposed to strain your eyes. Instead, this is supposed to give you ideas on things to think about. Remember, this is a design, build, operate, and maintain contract. So it's really a long-term contract. There's a reinvestment, there's a turnover section, there's a section that covers what the lender's going to do, there's an insurance section. There's a lot of different questions and answers that you need to think about as you're putting this forward. So we put these out there to try and identify what the key components are for that when you're looking at structuring the deal. You have to be able to enforce these contracts. We've done workouts on some public-private partnerships, and these contracts become key pieces. But you also have to make it so the project can be developed, the private party can make its revenue returns, the lender feels comfortable investing in this particular project as well. If we can go to the next slide. So the other thing that we look at is, you know, none of these contracts are standard, even though they tell you they are. One of the questions that came up is, hey, this is a little different than those larger ones. There may be less revenue generation. So when we look at this, you know, we'll get into this also in one of our other presentations where we talk about the RFP and RFQ. You need to look at really what fits for you, what fits for the size of the project, and what is your typical contracting mechanism and how that could work on the P3 in order to make this work. So we already talked about the requirements of the developer. We talked about the financer. As we go forward, recognize their motivations, and it has to work for all of the parties. Recognize your legal limitations and what you can do to make sure this fits in that particular project, and recognize that you need to put a project manager responsible for this to have the project review, approve the design, the oversight, all of those other types of things as you're moving forward. If we can go to the next slide. So the term of the project, we talked about this a little bit. The only thing I'm going to go into is that it's real important that you look at potential options for long-term. You may have to do your financing for 5 years because that's when the availability payment exists, but that doesn't mean this project can't exist beyond 5 years. You may want to put an option in there to see how the concessions are working out. Remember, procurements take a long time, and so give yourself as much flexibility as possible. That's what a lot of the local governments that I work for, that's one of the key things that they talk about is, let's make sure we don't have to go through multiple procurements to get the same thing if we have an operator who's performing properly. So let's go to the next slide. And so the contract terms, these are some more questions for you to think about as we're going forward. Will the payments cover the O&M? You know, can you have the availability payment cover, you know, just the design and construction? You have to look at these things ahead of time. What are the risks to the private sector? How much of the risk are you pushing off and how much are you keeping? This is really critical, especially when issues pop up, to make sure that there is still real risk to the private sector, that you as the government are not taking on all the risk. You're providing a long-term, the 5-year payment is a long-term payment as we're moving forward on this. Look at the revenue sharing. Can you do revenue sharing is always a question. Does it work for you? Is this an important piece? Do you even care about the revenue sharing piece? If you don't, can those additional revenues go back to reinvesting in the particular project or even building out additional EVCI infrastructure as we're going forward? What's the availability payment source after 5 years? Do you have that identified? The lenders for a long-term project are going to be asking that question. Make sure you have the legal authorities we already talked about. Operational standards and performance are key issues as you go forward. You know, is there a way to correct issues if they're not performing the way that they want without kicking out the developer? So in other words, are you going to impact the revenue? Are you going to impact how those particular issues? Reinvestment and replacements, important. Turnover is really critical as we go forward. And so the other thing is, many times the developers, they're going to tell you that they're in for the long term, but they're really trying to get these constructed, have the revenue stream start, and then they try and sell the project as well. So you need to look at the ability to sign and oversight related to those issues. So that next slide, that's a lot to think about as we go forward. We'll have Q&A at the end. And with that, I want to hand it over to Christy at Jones Lang LaSalle.
Actually, we're going to turn it over to Zach and Christy, and we'll come back to some questions in a little bit. So this section covers funding and financing, and let's let the speakers introduce themselves. Christy, next slide, please.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I am Christy. I am Senior Vice President.
Can't hear you, Christy.
If I speak up, can you hear me better?
It's still pretty muted.
Okay, I'm going to try to really project.
Okay, there you go.
Okay. I am Christy David. I'm a senior vice president and the lead of the project finance advisory team within the Clean Energy and Infrastructure Group at JLL. I have, for the past 17 years, advised governments on all levels, financial institutions, and developers on project finance and P3 transactions, and have helped successfully close over $60 billion worth of infrastructure. Zach?
Everyone, good afternoon, good morning. My name is Zach Carson. I'm a manager with Rebel Group. We're a financial and transaction advisor. We do work across infrastructure sectors, and we specialize in public-private partnerships, innovative funding and finance, and alternative project delivery. So I'm here in my capacity as a consultant with the Build America Center, where as we have authored a paper that I'll give just the highlights of today regarding structuring options for performance-based contracts under the NEVI program. And if we go to the next slide, please. So the Build America Center offers educational programs, information, and resources for transportation agencies, including technical assistance for EV charging infrastructure, contracting, and procurement. And so we've had a few engagements with states regarding their EV charging infrastructure, contracting, and procurement strategy. And some of that preliminary research and analysis that we've done in the context of helping a particular state, we've used to make some general insights and observations about potential contract structures and mechanisms and how to incorporate performance-based elements into a contracting strategy for EVCI. And so our primary focus is really thinking about how to structure contracts for bundles of sites. A lot of states and local agencies are looking at a more site-specific approach. In that case, some of the mechanisms that we're going to talk about in this paper and that I'll highlight today may not make as much sense for you just because of the sort of extra complexity and cost associated with building these into your contract. But we do see that there's a lot of benefit to bundling sites. Seth touched on that a little bit in terms of looking at the ability to cross-subsidize and spread risk across a bundle of sites rather than just one. And so as part of this approach, we looked at a really more nuanced view on risk allocation and how to structure that in contracts. A lot of the insights that we discuss in our paper were primarily geared towards states, but very much apply as well for local agencies and for agencies that are looking to build not just DC fast charging on alternative fuel corridors, but also level 2 charging, community charging, and some of the other use cases that were highlighted at the beginning of the presentation. And so we tried to look at some of the key principles of P3 contracting and procurement from other infrastructure sectors, but tailor that to the unique characteristics of this market and this asset class, some of which have been already covered today. And so we see the fundamental purpose of the federal funding to accelerate project development for projects that would not be independently financially feasible, which means they're relying on some form of public subsidy. And another objective, of course, is the consistency and reliability. So ensuring that these stations perform well throughout their life cycle. And so from the perspective of a EV charging infrastructure developer who is delivering a bundle of sites, there really are two primary risks when looking at a performance-based contract. There's the risk that they won't receive the full subsidy from the public sector because they're not performing adequately or to the specifications in the contract. And then there's the risk that the user revenues won't materialize to the level that they project. So this chart shows those two primary risks. There's also, of course, risk on the construction and design side, which is sort of handled traditionally through various contracting mechanisms. So our paper explores how to tackle these particular risks in a nuanced way. And we'll go to the next slide, please. So one specific topic from the paper we wanted to highlight is different ways to structure the payment mechanism, ranging from the EVCI developer taking less to more commercial risk. Again, some of this was touched upon already, but there are various ways to look at structuring that payment from the public agency to the private contractor. On one end of the spectrum, there would be 100% user fee structure. That basically means the project is independently feasible and wouldn't require any funding. So we're not talking about that end of the spectrum. And on the other end, it would be 100% availability payment structure. So this means all of the commercial risk remains with the public agency. And we've generally seen that many agencies are not excited about being in this business and taking that risk. So we're really focusing on between these two extremes, coming up with some different structures, which include a performance-based grant structure. This is very similar to an availability payment in P3s, in which case a fixed amount is deducted, has deductions based on the developer's performance and operator's performance, I should say. And then the other structure is a revenue sharing, a minimum revenue guarantee, where the bidder would bid a certain minimum revenue amount and the public agency would make up the difference. There could still be performance deductions in a mechanism like that. And both of these mechanisms can also build in a revenue sharing. So this would allow the public agency to capture upside if commercial revenues do exceed expectations. So that leads to the options 4 and 2 below, which both protect some downside risk for a private company bidding on an EVCI bundle project, but also allows the public agency to capture some of that upside. So the paper explores the pros and cons of some of these different options. Next slide, please. The discussion paper also walks through other important considerations for structuring performance-based contracts under the federal grant programs, such as how to structure the contract term and other key details regarding how the payment mechanism works in more detail. Next slide, please. So finally, 2 other important topics that are covered in this discussion paper are handback and supervening events. These are key topics from the traditional P3 world, and they're also very important for a performance-based contract for a bundle of EV charging infrastructure sites. We would encourage you to download the paper to learn a little bit more about this and why it's so critical. And we do very much also appreciate hearing from you if there's other topics that you would want the Build America Center to look into further as it relates to specific contracting and procurement challenges that you're running into as you're doing these projects. Next slide, please. One more, Christy, I know this is your slide, but I wanted to just add one more thing, which is that the Build America Center does offer technical assistance to agencies that are looking for help in terms of a peer review or any sort of conversations about their contracting and procurement strategy. So we've worked with several agencies to help them think through the best way to incorporate performance-based contracting elements into their contracting approach. And if you're interested in that support, Build America Center offers it for free, and just contact Patrick. His contact information, I think, is available to you all. So thank you. Christy, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Zach. Okay, well, we are going to now think about, just step away from the feasibility challenges and contractual structures and really kind of dig into funding and financing mechanisms for EVCI, potentially P3 projects. But before we really jump into that, I did want to first start by showing you this diagram. And what this is a typical P3 wire diagram that not only shows flow of funds, but also contractual arrangement relationships. And the point of this is to say, if we kind of divided this into quadrants, we'd be looking at that entire right side in terms of financing. So those green boxes, both equity and debt. And then in the upper left-hand side, the public sector, which might be in the form of not only availability payments, but milestone payments. With respect to an EVCI project, this diagram might show, it doesn't here, but it could change and show user fees that flow directly to the project company And then we would expect that those fees would be used to repay not only operating costs, but then repay lenders and investors. And then the public funding, probably pretty similar, because we've sort of shown, we've given you two options, milestones or availability payments, if in fact those are used, or some other type of mechanism. Next slide. So here, just the question is, well, what's the benefit to a public agency, especially a local one, in introducing a P3 structure to an EDCI project? And really, with respect to funding and financing, is that it sort of broadens your options, right? So in terms of funding flexibility, there's access to NEVI, and then also for communities, the Charging and Fueling Infrastructure Grant Program. And then, of course, there are also other potential federal or state grants available. Financing flexibility is also opened up because now you have a P3 structure, you have a private partner who can access capital markets and private equity and debt. And then sort of wrapped up in both of these is this idea of just the risk transfer in general, which means here a public agency can avoid further indebtedness by passing that type of obligation on to a private sector. It also mitigates exposure to revenue risk, something that potentially public agencies don't have the resources to manage, but a private partner who's specifically in this industry would. Next slide, please. Okay, here, now we're going to talk about funding. And really, there are two, for especially communities and local agencies, there are two programs that are specifically designed to support you on the funding of EVCI. So this first one that we're showing here on this slide is for the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure, or NEVI, formula program. And a little brief overview is that I think of it as the 5-5-50, but it's $5 billion over 5 years for 50 states and DC and Puerto Rico. And it's any funds from the NEVI program would be available to cover 80% of your eligible project costs. However, that project must comply with the Title 23 terms underneath the within the United States Code. That can be discussed further, but part of that is that project income there's limitations on how you can use project income, and those limitations generally involve applying that income to debt service, O&M, operations and maintenance, rehabilitation costs, a reasonable ROI for your investor, possibly revenue sharing with public entities where applicable. And then the other thing, though, is that, you know, the way that you might also use NEVI funds, right? So kind of thinking about what are the NEVI funds and now how can we use them? Well, a public agency may be able to use NEVI funds in different ways. And the first could be a direct subsidy. So if you think back to that chart that I opened with, it could be an availability payment where, let's say you're in a rural community, you don't expect investors to necessarily be enticed by heavy user fees as an income or revenue source. So then you may be able to set up an availability payment through the NEVI funds, ensuring a certain level of return on the investment, right? And then another option would be a de-risking mechanism. And in this case, what you'd be doing is, for example, and you could, enter into an arrangement with the private partner where you're not necessarily just fully handing them money as an availability payment, but you're saying, okay, well, let's set up this arrangement where we have a minimum revenue guarantee. So if you don't hit that revenue level within a certain time frame, we'll fill the gap. And then, of course, you can also just do a combination of those two as part of a structuring with the P3 agreement. Okay. Next slide, please. Earlier, I'd mentioned that there are actually two funding mechanisms. This is the other one that is specifically targeted to communities. It is the what we call the CFI grant program. And here, what we're looking at is 2.5 billion allocated over 5 years to states, local governments, tribes, etc. They've already allocated 700 or made 700 million available in 2022 and 2023. Now, there are two tracks that you could follow with this grant program. And the first is called the corridor charging track, and the second is the community charging track. Corridor charging, this is really relates to funding for designated alternative fuel corridors. And then community charging is different, where it's the intent is to install EVCI in locations by public schools, parks, parking facilities. The key to community charging track is prioritizing the rural and low and moderate income. Okay, next slide. Right here, jumping into financing, we typically think, but well, the financing's undertaken by the private sector. Why do we care? But in fact, it's still important for the public agency to consider certain criteria when they're developing, maybe potentially their procurement documents or any type of project arrangements that they'd like to make. And so this slide sort of lists out what are some of the criteria that you should be considering as well, or the public agency should be considering during that time. And some of the key points here are the cost of construction and operations and maintenance, the demand for the charging service driven, in that location, and expected user fees, charging fees, and then the cost of capital, equity, and debt. That would be important in your process of thinking about, especially if were offering some type of de-risking mechanism or an availability payment. So these, speak to, if you have an advisor, these are important things that you can have, your advisor can support you on as well. Then the next slide. In this slide, what we're really doing is wrapping up and thinking about, okay, well, a lot of what we've discussed is sort of more general, but kind of let's think about this more for local governments and communities. And so the first thing is that in general, what we have been discussing is relevant to you in terms of market and finance. What you might expect to see more of are level 2, or might expect to be more relevant in like on the local level, are these level 2 chargers. Level 2 EVCI, it might make more sense because typically they're drastically less costly. And in ways that you can sort of like capitalize on that is by leasing your public property or monetizing an asset. For example, municipal buildings, schools, libraries. So that actually means that it could be a way for a community or local government to raise funds using your own assets, right? You might be able to raise revenues for other things to support other costs in your community. And then from there, you might also start to think about a more traditional P3 with performance-based contracting structures when capital expenses really scale up and might meet a certain threshold where it makes sense to involve yourself in a more costly and intricate arrangement with a private partner. Of course, there's always you could always consider bundling offers to private partners. So not just one location and making that one arrangement, but it could in fact be that you have multiple locations and you're looking for a private partner to cover all of them. And then, of course, there is the extra layer to think about for local governments and communities, and that is that ensuring that local contracting and procurement laws create P3-like contractual structures, and that you're at least and that you're complying with them, right? You're complying with your local contracting and procurement laws to create P3-like contractual structures. So thank you. If you have any questions, please let us know.
Okay, thank you, Christy. I appreciate that. We had a couple of minutes for questions here, but we're running a little behind, so I think I'm going to move right on to Rob McCracken from the city of Cincinnati, the energy manager, and I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce yourself, Rob. And we will have some questions at the end when you finish. Thank you. Go right ahead.
Great. Thanks a lot, Mike. Thanks everybody for attending this webinar today. So the City of Cincinnati, we have started to embark on a journey of figuring out how we can bring EV charging infrastructure, both for the public to access as well as for our fleet. My role here at the city is I serve as the energy manager, so I'm dealing both with the amount of energy we're using, and I guess because EVs use electricity, I'm now dealing with EVs. So been working on this for about a year as we've begun this process. So we go ahead to the next slide here. One of the things that we've noticed, or I've noticed, I should say, over the course of this presentation is a lot of things that were covered today were things that I wish I knew 9 months ago when we started through this process, whether it's from the contractual side or the financing side. So I wanted to give you just an overview of what our initial considerations were, things we were thinking about as we began this process. First of all, we recognize that as a city, we have pretty extensive property assets, whether that is, recreation centers, parks along our curbside in the right of way, as well as in other city-owned facilities. We have assets where EV charging infrastructure can be installed. Second thing we recognize is that we have limited capital assets. I'm sure this is true for a lot of other local governments, but our capital budget, there's a lot of tension there, a lot of things that need those capital dollars. And right now, EV charging infrastructure just wouldn't be one of them. So if we can enter into public-private partnerships and kind of leverage the operating budget side of things, that allows us to kind of utilize the funds that we do have available to invest in this. Third thing is, as a city, we're kind of hesitant to be on the leading edge of investing in new technology. We do not have, we don't want to be the ones owning and operating these things at this point in time. We don't have the capacity internally. We don't have the expertise. We'd rather develop that over time and get a feel for how that technology works, build our capacity internally, and then potentially in the future take ownership of it. And the last thing helping to drive this whole concept for the city is the climate goals that we have for city operations. We want to be 100% renewable by 2035. And then as a community, we want to be net zero by 2050. So what steps can we take now to help us achieve those goals? Go to the next slide, please. So we looked at this in two different ways, and we have two different projects we're working on kind of in parallel. The first one is our public charging infrastructure, and that is how can we leverage our public right-of-way or those parking lots I talked about earlier for a vendor to install charging infrastructure. So we released an RFP in early 2023. We're in the final stages of the contracting process, working through many of the issues that Seth brought up earlier on in the presentation as we get to finalize that contract. So, the idea behind this is that the vendor will leverage or use the city assets. In exchange for using our assets, we'll receive a share of the profits of each charger over the course of the term of the agreement. We needed to protect ourselves as a city. And so, we kind of have a couple, an initial term of 5 years and then the ability to extend the term over time. And then, we're working with the vendor to make sure that we recognize that they have an initial investment that they need to recoup. And so if for some reason the city does want to, break the contract at the end of a term, not renew a term, we recognize that there's going to be some cost that we would bear in order to take ownership of that. So those are kind of the ideas and topics that we're talking through here as we finalize our contract. Switching over to the fleet charging side, we have two different sides to that as well. One is we're trying to figure out exactly what we need to do. So we're having a fleet electrification study that we're working on right now. That's to look at all our vehicles, help us identify what vehicles we can transition to EVs, when we should transition them, and once we do, how do we charge them and where do we charge them? So that's kind of our first phase of this, is really getting the lay of the land and developing a plan for what we want to do. That's then going to allow us to move to our second component, which is really going to be our EV charging infrastructure. And so, right now, like I said, we don't really know how much infrastructure is needed, where we want it. or when we'll need it. And so this plan is really going to help guide that. And, we also know that, as we mentioned earlier, we do not have a really large capital budget, but we do have an operating budget. There are operating, expenses in there for fuel, for existing internal combustion engine vehicles. So how do we use those funds that are in the budget and kind of protected annually in order to help pay for this EV charging infrastructure? And so that's where these ideas of the P3 is really appealing to us as a city is, can we provide, parking areas, behind the fence at city facilities where our fleet vehicles are housed, have a vendor come in and install that infrastructure, design, build, finance, operate, maintain for a certain amount of years, whether we're paying, for the electricity and then kind of paying them for, using the chargers, whether we're just paying a per kilowatt hour fee, whatever it may be, really trying to identify which of those solutions work for us. Always with the opportunity or the eye in the future, we may want to take ownership of that. So those are kind of some of the things that we're experiencing right now. The RFPs that we put out should be available on the Cincinnati procurement website if you're interested in looking at them. Again, I think a lot of the things that we're learning through this experience are issues that were covered by other speakers during this presentation. So I wish I had seen this presentation several months ago when we started down this journey. So that gives you a little overview of where we are in the city of Cincinnati. And I'll turn it back to Mike here to see if we have any questions or answers. Thanks for your time, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert. Appreciate it. Sounds like the city is headlong into the process. We've got a few minutes to do some Q&A. You can add your questions into the chat if you'd like. We have a couple that have come in, and the most common question we've gotten several times in several different forms is, how many P3s are there? How many states are moving forward with procurements? What's the status? And I can't tell you exactly how many P3s there are. I can tell you that to date, there are about 9 closed solicitations across the country from states. There are an additional 8 solicitations that are open today in some form. That could be a request for information or a request for proposal. And another 5 have provided a notice of intent to move forward. So that's about half the states so far have taken action, and over half of those have P3 in the thinking process. Some of them do not use P3s, but the majority of them are open to P3s. So it's an opportunity going forward. Let's see. Let me look at some of these other questions here. Again, different ways to ask the same question. Well, with a question about the 5-year period, Seth addressed that a bit. There's no reason to be handicapped by the 5-year period. That's part of the NEVI program, not necessarily part of your planning process, and you can make changes to that as you see fit in negotiating with your public-private partner, with your private sector partner, and build that into the contract with a good attorney like Seth, making the agreement for longer than the 5 years, or associated with the life of the equipment or the turnover of the equipment in various ways. So the 5-year, I would encourage everyone to download the 2 reports that are available. One is the Revel report on structuring, and the other is the state of the practice report, which gives a lot of this information that Seth and Christy and Zach have gone over this afternoon and this morning in a little more depth, and you can dig into that and take a look at it and understand some of the things that are being asked. Let's see. We were asked to outline the pros and cons of P3 versus providing NEVI funding directly to the private sector. Any of our speakers like to address that? Seth, would you like to address that?
Sure. I think it'll depend very much on your own individual situation as you're going forward. So, a P3, as we just heard, does take staff capacity to oversee it, to manage it. But at the same time, what you do is you have a private sector that's overseeing the construction, implementation, operation, and maintenance of the particular project. So over the long term, that may help, but there's a lot of variables. You got to look at your state law, what you can do, what you can't do, what the particular upfront costs are. In this program, what's great about the NEVI program is that you have those 5 years of availability payments to help support the project after the project becomes operational. And in a P3, you can really leverage that out to hopefully be a longer term as well. And obviously, it's a benefit on both sides. In the report, we do try and provide some of those, the pros and cons. But you'd have to get into the individual scenario to really talk about whether it works well for you or not. And I just want to echo that there is the technical assistance available that we talked about earlier. So please avail yourself of that.
Seth, I actually have another question for you that just came in. One of the attendees mentioned that you talked about the length of a traditional P3 procurement process, and the questioner wonders about how much shorter an EVCI P3 procurement process might be when compared to a traditional P3.
Yeah, it's funny. Jones Lang LaSalle and us have talked about that a fair amount as we've kind of gone through and looked at the report, and the next report that's coming out covers some of these things. But I personally believe that you can go through a shorter process because of the valuation of these particular projects. I think you just have to be more clear in your program, and you also have to decide, if you want to have the full agreement created at the time that the parties are bidding on it. And then you also, you just need to make sure that you understand that the comments that come in will be a lot more than you would typically get if you go through an RFQ down select and then you have a smaller amount of parties going through the RFP. But I do believe it can save you time and money to probably shorten the process. Once again, I'm assuming a lot of things. So I'm assuming that this is a smaller value and those types of things, and that that the capacity and the legal authorities for you to do that also exist.
Great. I have another one for Zach and/or Christy. For program income, what is a reasonable rate of return for an EVCI project?
So, hi, I can jump in. I think that what I always try to do is qualify any statement saying that really depends on your location and those and private investors who are interested in engaging in a P3 with you. What we at JLL have seen with our clients that we're engaging with is, and this is very rough, I'd rather give you a range, but I'll just say roughly you're looking at maybe 10-12%. That's what we've seen. Now, I understand that potentially that could be as high as 18%. But again, it's really a range. I would say definitely in conversations that I've had, after going lower than 9%, not likely.
Yeah, I'll just add, the Build America Center has done some research on rates of return for traditional P3s. And so that is also potentially a useful benchmark to consider for these projects. And the range that Christy cited is definitely within reason for traditional P3s as well.
Thank you, Zach.
The only other thing I want to throw in that there's different parties. So don't forget, sometimes it could be one party that is responsible for both the installation and construction and the operation and management. Sometimes they're subbing out one or the other to another party. So the rates of return for the various parties that are the subcontractors will also play into this as well, in addition to the overarching party that's the actual bidder on the project. So, and there may be profit centers in each one of those that changes the valuation, and then there's also a profit center potentially in financing pieces. So you got to take all those things into account.
Thank you, Seth. Ethan, can you go ahead and post the slides to the chat? And if you could also type in the names of the reports in the chat so people will have them. And if we can go to the next slide, I'm going to turn it over to Patrick to close us out. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Thanks, Mike. And I don't see the reports in the chat, but we'll make sure that we send them out by email to everybody that registered, along with a link to the recording as soon as this is ready for you, as well as the slides. So I just want to close by reminding everybody that this was the first of 3 webinars. Next month, on February 27th, we will have a webinar on the procurement process for P3s, and that will include how to engage the market and select partners. And finally, in March 27th, again, this is only for local governments, we would have a webinar on tools and guides for P3 feasibility and financial structuring. We will be emailing out the announcement of these webinars so you can register, as well as for the 2 training courses, one for states, the other for local governments, which will be in-person trainings. So in case you haven't had a chance to download the reports and the slide presentation, we will definitely get them out to you by email soon. And we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar on March 27th. Thank you all for attending, and sorry for the couple of minutes extra time we took. Goodbye.
Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.